They say laughter is universal. Every species that reaches the stars develops some form of humor, some way to cope with the vastness of space and the weight of intelligence. But, when Zara-Th clicked her mandibles in what her people called Kethmore, the sound of superiority mixed with pity, she had no idea she was about to witness something that would reshape how the galaxy viewed humanity forever. The human before her looked so ordinary. Soft pink skin, no natural weapons, standing barely 2 meters tall. His ship was a rust bucket freighter held together with what appeared to be metal tape and sheer stubbornness. When he claimed he could help her people against the Void Hunters, the unstoppable force that had consumed 17 star systems, she couldn't contain her amusement. She laughed. It was the last time anyone in the galaxy would ever laugh at a human. What followed wasn't just a victory. It wasn't just a battle. It was the moment humanity announced itself to the cosmos not as the weakest species to reach the stars, but as something far more dangerous, the species that turns impossibility into inevitability. This is the story of how one human's response to mockery became the foundation of legends that would be told across 1,000 worlds for 1,000 years. Captain Marcus Chen had seen better days, and his ship had definitely seen better decades. The Persistence groaned as it dropped out of hyperspace near the Kythera system, her fusion engines sputtering like an old man with a bad cough. The hull patches told stories of 100 close calls, and the duct tape holding the navigation console together had become a running joke among the few humans who still traveled the outer rim. Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead as he guided his freighter toward the massive space station orbiting Kythera Prime. The structure was beautiful in the way only alien architecture could be, flowing organic curves that seemed to breathe in the starlight, bioluminescent panels pulsing with gentle blue rhythms. It made his battered human vessel look like a tin can floating next to a work of art. "Unknown vessel, state your business." The translation came through in crisp Standard Galactic, but Marcus could hear the musical undertones of the Kytheran language beneath it. "This is Captain Chen of the independent freighter Persistence," Marcus replied, trying to sound more professional than he felt. "I'm here about your posted distress beacon." "Something about the Void Hunters?" There was a pause long enough that Marcus wondered if his comm system had finally given up. "Then, please proceed to docking bay 7. You will be evaluated." The way the translator rendered evaluated made it sound like they weren't sure whether to arrest him or dissect him for science. Docking Bay 7 was clearly designed for smaller ships, but the Persistence managed to squeeze in with only minor scraping sounds that Marcus pretended not to hear. As he cycled through the airlock, he caught his reflection in the polished metal and grimaced. 5 days of hyperspace travel without proper hygiene facilities had not been kind. His brown hair stuck up at odd angles, his uniform was rumpled, and he probably smelled like recycled air and desperation. The reception committee was waiting for him on the other side. The Kytherans were an elegant species, tall and graceful with chitinous skin that shifted color with their emotions. They moved like dancers, every gesture flowing into the next with liquid precision. Their leader stepped forward, a female by human standards, though Marcus knew Kytherans had 17 different gender classifications that his brain couldn't properly process. She was magnificent. Her carapace was a deep blue-green that reminded Marcus of Earth's oceans, with silver traceries running along her arms and neck like living jewelry. Her large, compound eyes caught the light in ways that made them seem almost luminous, and, when she moved, it was with the kind of confidence that came from being apex predators who had evolved past the need for violence. "I am Zara-Th, voice of the Kythera Council," she said, her actual voice a series of musical clicks and whistles that the translator rendered into words. "You claim to have information about the Void Hunters?" Marcus straightened his shoulders and tried to look like someone worth taking seriously. "Yes, ma'am. I've been tracking their movement patterns for the last 6 months. Lost my entire convoy to them near the Helix Nebula, but I managed to learn some things that might help." Zara-Th's head tilted slightly, and her carapace shifted to a lighter shade of blue, curiosity mixed with skepticism, if Marcus was reading her body language correctly. "And you believe this information is valuable enough to warrant our attention?" "Valuable enough that I crossed half the galaxy to get here," Marcus replied. "The Void Hunters aren't just raiders. They're systematic. They're following a pattern, and if I'm right about what that pattern is, your system is next on their list." Around the docking bay, other Kitharans had gathered to observe the strange human. Marcus could see them whispering among themselves, their carapaces shifting through spectrums of color that probably meant things his human brain couldn't decode. He felt like a primitive being examined by angels. "Please," one of the younger Kitharans clicked, "share with us this great wisdom from the species that has been in space for, what, 200 years? We who have sailed between stars for millennia surely have much to learn from human insights." The sarcasm needed no translation. Even across species barriers, mockery was universal. Marcus felt heat creep up his neck, but he kept his voice steady. "Look, I know how this seems. Trust me, I get it. Humans are the new kids on the galactic block. We're primitive, we're violent, and half our ships are held together with spare parts and prayer. But sometimes being new means seeing things differently." Zarath raised one elegant hand, and the murmuring stopped. "Very well, human Marcus-chan. We will hear your wisdom. But understand, we have consulted with the finest military minds across 7 species. The Altarian Strategic Council, with their 1,000 years of tactical experience. The Zenkari battle philosophers, who treat warfare as high art. The Crystalline Collective, whose computational powers exceed anything your species can imagine. All have declared the Void Hunters unstoppable." She gestured to a wall display that flickered to life, showing a 3-dimensional map of local space. Red dots marked systems that had gone dark, 17 of them, each one representing billions of lives snuffed out in Void Hunter raids. The pattern was indeed systematic, a spreading wave of destruction moving through inhabited space like a cancer. "They appear from nowhere," Zarath continued, her voice carrying the weight of species-wide fear. "Their ships are massive beyond comprehension, their technology centuries ahead of ours. They consume everything: resources, populations, entire worlds, and leave nothing behind but empty space. Our greatest fleets have engaged them 3 times. Each time, we were annihilated without destroying a single enemy vessel." Marcus studied the map, his mind racing. He'd seen this before, this pattern of hopelessness. He'd felt it himself when the Void Hunters had torn through his convoy like tissue paper, leaving him the sole survivor in a damaged freighter, watching his friends die in the cold vacuum of space. "What does your military doctrine say about fighting a superior force?" Marcus asked. "That one should seek advantageous terrain, superior numbers, or technological parity," replied one of the military advisors. "Since we have none of these options available, conventional wisdom suggests evacuation or surrender." "There's a 4th option," Marcus said quietly. Zarath's carapace shifted to a pale yellow, surprise. "Which is?" "Change the rules of engagement." The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear the hum of the station's environmental systems. Then, slowly, Zarath's mandibles began to click in the rhythmic pattern that Marcus's translator couldn't quite render properly. She was laughing at him. "Change the rules," she repeated, and now others were joining in the laughter, their combined clicking creating a symphony of amusement. "The human suggests we simply change the rules." As if warfare were a game with malleable regulations. Marcus felt every eye in the docking bay focused on him, felt the weight of their sophisticated amusement. These beings had been exploring space when his ancestors were still figuring out fire. They had technologies that seemed like magic, art forms that could drive humans mad with their beauty, philosophical concepts that stretched human understanding to its limits. And they thought he was a fool. "You know what?" Marcus said, and something in his voice made the laughter die away. "You're right to laugh. Humans are primitive. We've been in space for 2 centuries, and we're still using chemical rockets for some of our ships. We fight wars with kinetic weapons while you have particle beams. We haven't solved faster-than-light communication, we haven't figured out matter transmission, and half our colonies survive on freeze-dried food and recycled air." He stepped forward, and somehow the assembled Kitharans gave ground before him despite being individually stronger, faster, and more intelligent. "But there's something you need to understand about humans," Marcus continued, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet docking bay. "We don't just change the rules when we can't win. We throw the entire rulebook out the window. We look at impossible situations and say, hold my beer. We take the worst possible circumstances and find ways to make them work for us. Zara Th had stopped laughing, her carapace now a deep purple that Marcus hoped didn't mean she was about to call security. When humans first reached space, Marcus said, everyone told us it was impossible to build colonies without massive infrastructure support. So we learned to build infrastructure out of garbage and good intentions. When we encountered our first alien species, the Centaurians, they had technology centuries ahead of ours. Everyone said we'd become their vassals or their victims. Instead, he continued, we became their trading partners by offering them something they'd never had, human entertainment. Turns out beings who've solved all their practical problems still want to laugh at stories about idiots doing impossible things. Marcus pulled up his own datapad, showing a different view of the same star map. But his version had additional markers, shipping lanes, resource deposits, gravitational anomalies, and a dozen other factors that the Kithaeron display had ignored as militarily irrelevant. The Void Hunters are systematic, he said. They follow predictable patterns because their technology is so advanced they don't need to be creative. They just overwhelm everything in their path. But that systematic approach means they have systematic weaknesses. Zara Th leaned closer to study his display. What weaknesses could beings of such power possibly possess? Marcus smiled, and, for the first time since entering the docking bay, he felt like himself again. They think like you do. Like every advanced species in the galaxy. They fight wars the way wars are supposed to be fought. They follow the rules of engagement that have worked for thousands of years. And humans don't? Lady, Marcus said, humans wrote the book on fighting dirty. The docking bay was silent again, but this time it was the silence of attention rather than amusement. Marcus could see interest flickering in the colors of Kithaeron carapaces around the room. The Void Hunters will be here in 72 hours, Marcus continued. Your fleets can't stop them, and your planets can't hide from them. If you fight them the way everyone else has, you'll lose the way everyone else has. But if you let a human show you how to cheat. Marcus let the sentence hang in the air like a challenge. Around the docking bay, Kithaerons were looking at each other with rapidly shifting color patterns that his translator couldn't decode. But he didn't need translation to recognize the moment when sophisticated beings started wondering if the crazy primitive might actually have a point. Zara Th stepped closer, her large eyes reflecting the light from his datapad. What exactly are you proposing, human? Marcus looked at the assembled Kithaerons, their elegant forms, their advanced technology, their thousands of years of civilization and sophisticated military doctrine. Then, he thought about his battered freighter held together with duct tape and determination, about human colonies that thrived in places where they shouldn't be able to survive, about a species that had turned stubbornness into an art form. I'm proposing we give the Void Hunters exactly what they don't expect, he said. A fight so stupid, so impossible, so completely contrary to everything they know about warfare, that they won't know how to respond. And if this plan fails? Marcus shrugged. Then, you'll die the way you were going to die anyway. But, if it works. He gestured to the star map, to the spreading pattern of destroyed worlds. If it works, we don't just save your system. We show every species in the galaxy that the Void Hunters can be beaten. Zara Th was quiet for a long moment, her carapace cycling through colors too fast for Marcus to follow. Finally, she looked up at him with those luminous compound eyes. Tell us about this impossible plan, human Marcus Chen. Marcus grinned, and began to speak. The war room aboard the Kithaeron command station buzzed with activity that would have seemed like controlled chaos to human eyes. Holographic displays showed fleet positions, resource allocations, and tactical projections in dimensions that human minds struggled to process. The assembled beings represented the finest military minds in local space, not just Kithaerons, but Altarian strategists with their crystalline thought matrices, Zenkari battle philosophers whose understanding of warfare transcended simple violence, and even a delegation from the reclusive Vorthan Empire. Marcus Chen sat in the center of it all, looking like a scruffy mechanic who had wandered into a gathering of gods. This plan, Admiral Kethvar clicked slowly, his ancient carapace showing stress patterns that spoke of centuries of military service, violates every principle of tactical doctrine developed over the last millennium. That's the point, Marcus replied, manipulating the holographic display with clumsy human fingers while beings with neural interfaces watched in bewilderment. The Void Hunters have encountered every form of conventional warfare. They've adapted to every strategy, countered every tactic. They're like a virus that's become immune to every antibiotic. So your solution is to inject poison instead of medicine? The question came from Seer Commander Thax, whose Altarian crystal form glowed with skeptical energy patterns. Marcus paused in his manipulation of the display. Around him, 17 different species military leaders waited for an answer to a question that could determine the fate of billions. In human medical history, Marcus said carefully, we once had a plague that killed 1/3 of our population. Traditional medicine couldn't touch it. You know what finally worked? Controlled infection with a related but less deadly disease. We fought poison with poison. The gathered beings processed this information, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of clicks, harmonics, and energy fluctuations that the translation matrix struggled to render. Explain your strategy in simple terms, Zara-Th requested. She had become his primary advocate in the hours since his arrival, though Marcus suspected it was more curiosity than confidence driving her support. Marcus took a deep breath and activated a new section of the holographic display. The star map rotated, showing the predicted path of the Void Hunter fleet, massive ships that moved like cosmic predators, consuming everything in their wake. The Void Hunters expect resistance, he began. They expect fleets arrayed against them in defensive formations. They expect evacuation attempts, distress calls, and all the logical responses of civilized species facing extinction. Because that is how rational beings behave when confronted with superior force, Admiral Kethvar observed. Exactly. And they've developed countermeasures for every rational response. Marcus highlighted several points on the map. But humans aren't always rational. Sometimes we're too stupid to know when we're beaten. He manipulated the display again, showing fleet movements that made several alien commanders vocalize distress in their native languages. Instead of fighting them, Marcus continued, we're going to invite them to a party. The silence that followed was so profound that the station's atmospheric recyclers seemed loud by comparison. A party? Zara-Th's voice carried a note that the translator rendered as concern for sanity. Look at their attack pattern, Marcus said, ignoring the obvious skepticism around him. They arrive in system, assess the defensive capabilities, then systematically eliminate resistance before harvesting resources. They've done this 17 times with identical tactics because those tactics work perfectly against any rational defense. He zoomed in on the Kythera system, showing ship positions and resource sites. But what if there's no defense to assess? What if instead of military formations, they find the entire system having what appears to be a massive celebration? Admiral Kethvar's stress patterns intensified. You propose to celebrate as they arrive to destroy us? I propose to confuse them long enough to get inside their decision loop, Marcus replied. Military doctrine assumes predictable responses. When the enemy does something completely outside your tactical models, you have to stop and figure out what's happening. And, while they're figuring, they're vulnerable. Marcus began highlighting specific points on the system map. Every civilian ship we can gather gets positioned along major shipping lanes with active sensor arrays broadcasting celebration signals. Music, light shows, what appears to be a massive cultural festival spanning the entire system. This is insane, muttered Commander Veltar of the Zenkari fleet. You would use our civilians as bait? I would use apparent civilians as misdirection, Marcus corrected. Because while the Void Hunters are trying to understand why an entire star system is throwing a party instead of evacuating, our actual combat vessels are doing something they'll never expect. He manipulated the display again, and, suddenly, the celebration ships began moving in patterns that weren't random at all. They were forming a complex three-dimensional net throughout the system, with civilian vessels serving as anchor points for what appeared to be some kind of massive construction project. You're building something, Zara-Th observed, her carapace shifting to colors Marcus was beginning to recognize as intense concentration. We're building a trap, Marcus confirmed. But, not for their ships. For their sensors. Marcus pulled up detailed schematics that he'd been working on since his arrival. Human ships use a lot of primitive technology, including something most advanced species abandoned centuries ago: crude electromagnetic pulse generation. It's inefficient, it's energy-intensive, and it's considered obsolete. Because more advanced sensor packages are immune to such interference, Admiral Kethvar pointed out. Right. Modern sensors are immune to normal EMP. But what if you scale it up by a factor of 10,000? The display showed a network of human freighters positioned throughout the system, each one carrying what appeared to be massive capacitor banks and primitive magnetic coils. This is impossible, Seer Commander Thax declared. The energy requirements alone would drain every power core in the system. Not if you're not trying to power it sustainably, Marcus replied. Humans have a saying, it doesn't have to work for long, it just has to work once. We're talking about a synchronized pulse that burns out every piece of human technology in the system but generates an electromagnetic cascade that makes every advanced sensor array in local space temporarily blind. The alien commanders began to understand what he was suggesting, and their reactions ranged from fascination to horror. You would cripple your own technology to interfere with theirs? Zara Th asked. Our technology is already crippled compared to theirs, Marcus pointed out. But we're used to operating with primitive equipment. They're not. When their sensors go dark, when their sophisticated targeting systems stop working, when their automated systems start failing. He smiled grimly. Well, that's when the actual fight begins. Marcus activated another section of the display, showing what appeared to be debris fields scattered throughout the outer system: destroyed ships, abandoned mining equipment, the detritus of a civilization in decline. Of course, those aren't really debris fields, he continued. They're concealed weapons platforms staffed by every pilot crazy enough to volunteer for a suicide mission. Primitive kinetic weapons, nuclear warheads, chemical explosives, everything the Void Hunters stopped defending against because no civilized species uses such crude technology anymore. The war room erupted in a cacophony of alien languages as the assembled commanders began to grasp the full scope of what Marcus was proposing. Some voices carried notes of admiration, others of disbelief, and, more than a few, of outright horror. This plan requires perfect coordination across multiple species, Admiral Kethvar observed. How do you propose to manage communications when your electromagnetic pulse will destroy conventional calm systems? Marcus's grin widened. Drums. I beg your pardon? Acoustic signals transmitted through ship hulls. Mechanical timers. Light signals using mirrors and focused stellar radiation. Every primitive communication method our ancestors developed before they discovered electronics. Marcus gestured to his data pad. I've spent the last 6 hours working with your engineers to develop a timing system based on orbital mechanics. No electronics required. Seer Commander Thax's crystal form pulsed with rapid energy patterns. You propose to coordinate a space battle using drums and mirrors? I propose to coordinate a space ambush using technology so primitive that when their systems recover from the EMP, they'll still be trying to figure out how we're communicating. Marcus pulled up one final display, a timeline showing the entire operation from the Void Hunter's arrival to what he optimistically labeled victory or glorious failure. Phase 1, they arrive to find a system-wide celebration that makes no tactical sense. Phase 2, while they're analyzing this anomaly, we trigger the EMP cascade. Phase 3, in the 30 minutes before their systems fully recover, we hit them with everything we've got from directions they can't track using weapons they stopped defending against centuries ago. And, if this fails? Zara Th asked quietly. Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking about his destroyed convoy, about the friends he'd watched die in vacuum, about the 17 systems that had already fallen to the Void Hunter's inexorable advance. If it fails, we die fighting instead of dying scared, he said finally. But, if it works, if we can prove that these unstoppable forces can be stopped, then every species in the galaxy learns that there's another way to fight impossible odds. Around the war room, alien minds that had spent millennia perfecting the art of sophisticated warfare began to contemplate the possibility of winning through pure, calculated chaos. The timeline is extremely tight, Admiral Kethvar observed. We have less than 60 hours to coordinate this operation across multiple fleets and species. Then, we'd better get started, Marcus replied. He stood up from his chair, looking around at beings whose worst day would still be more civilized than humanity's best. I need volunteers for the suicide positions, engineers who can work with primitive human technology, and pilots crazy enough to fly ships that shouldn't work into battle against enemies that can't be beaten. And where will you be during this impossible battle? Zara Th asked. Marcus checked his chronometer and headed for the door. Jury-rigging my rust bucket into the biggest EMP bomb this galaxy has ever seen. If we're going to do this, we might as well do it with style. As he left the war room, Marcus could hear the symphony of alien languages behind him as 17 species began planning for a battle that violated every rule of civilized warfare. It was exactly the kind of stupid, impossible, magnificent mess that humans specialized in. And, for the first time since the Void Hunters had destroyed his convoy, Marcuschen felt like they might actually have a chance. The Persistence had never looked worse, and Marcus had never been more proud of her. What had once been a battered freighter was now a flying electromagnetic bomb that defied every safety regulation in known space. Kitharan engineers had watched in fascination and horror as Marcus's crew, assembled from the dregs of the Outer Rim, had systematically violated the laws of physics and common sense. Captain Chen, came Zara Th's voice over the primitive acoustic communication system they'd rigged between ships. The Void Hunter fleet has entered the outer system. Marcus felt his stomach clench as he watched the sensor display. Even through the low-resolution screens that were all his ship could manage, the enemy vessels were terrifying. Each one was the size of a small moon, their dark hulls seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. They moved with the inexorable patience of cosmic predators who had never encountered meaningful resistance. All stations, this is Chen, Marcus spoke into the mechanical voice tube that connected to drum systems throughout his ship. Show time. Throughout the Kithara system, the most elaborate con in galactic history began to unfold. On the main shipping lanes, thousands of civilian vessels suddenly burst into activity. But, instead of the panicked evacuation the Void Hunters expected, they began broadcasting music, activating light displays, and generally behaving as if the arrival of world-destroying aliens was cause for celebration rather than terror. The effect on the Void Hunter formation was immediate and gratifying. Their inexorable advance slowed as massive sensor arrays tried to process what they were seeing. For beings who had conquered 17 systems through overwhelming force and predictable responses, the sight of a star system throwing a party was profoundly disturbing. Marcus watched the tactical display as the Void Hunter ships began to spread out, their formation loosening as individual commanders tried to understand the tactical situation. Perfect. Phase 2 in 30 seconds, he announced. Deep in the Persistence's cargo hold, 47 human freighter captains made final adjustments to the most dangerous collection of jury-rigged electronics in the galaxy. Each ship carried massive capacitor banks that would have made legitimate engineers weep, connected to magnetic coils that violated manufacturer specifications by orders of magnitude. 15 seconds, Marcus called out. Around the system, every human vessel prepared to sacrifice itself for 30 minutes of sensor blindness. 10, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fire. The electromagnetic pulse that erupted from 47 human ships simultaneously was visible to the naked eye, an expanding sphere of coruscating energy that washed through the Kithara system like the birth cry of a new star. Every piece of advanced technology in local space screamed electronic protest and went dark, including the sensors on every Void Hunter ship. For beings whose tactical doctrine relied on perfect information and overwhelming technological superiority, sudden blindness was more than inconvenient, it was impossible to process. The Void Hunter fleet hung motionless in space, their automated systems struggling to reboot, their commanders trying to understand how their perfect sensors had simply stopped working. They were still trying to understand when the attacks began. From what had appeared to be debris fields came missiles that should have been obsolete 1,000 years ago. Nuclear warheads guided by mechanical timers and primitive gyroscopes. Chemical explosives that detonated not with sophisticated targeting but with simple proximity fuses. Kinetic projectiles that relied on nothing more complex than Newton's laws of motion. The Void Hunter's defensive systems, calibrated to stop particle beams and quantum torpedoes, barely registered the primitive weapons until they started exploding against hull plating that hadn't been designed to stop crude fusion bombs. Direct hit on lead vessel, came the voice of Commander Yax Till through the acoustic system. Their outer hull is breached. Marcus felt a surge of fierce joy. They'd actually hurt one of the bastards. But the celebration was premature. The Void Hunters were adapting faster than anyone had hoped. Their sensors were coming back online, their automated defensive systems beginning to track the primitive projectiles. Within minutes, they'd adjust their defensive parameters to account for archaic weapons. "All attack wings, this is Chen," Marcus announced. "Time for Phase 3. What happened next would be debated in tactical academies for centuries to come, assuming anyone survived to build tactical academies. The apparent celebration fleet, thousands of civilian vessels that had been broadcasting music and light shows, suddenly began moving in patterns that revealed their true nature. They weren't civilians at all, but every combat-capable ship from 7 different species, disguised with holographic projectors and sensor spoofing. More importantly, they were moving in a coordination pattern that should have been impossible without sophisticated electronics. How are they coordinating? Marcus could hear the confusion in Zaratieh's transmitted voice. Even she didn't fully understand what he'd planned for this phase. "Music," Marcus replied, grinning despite the desperate circumstances. "Every ship in the fleet is receiving the same acoustic signal, a piece of human music called the 1812 Overture. The tempo changes in the music correspond to tactical maneuvers. When the violins crescendo, you turn to starboard. When the cannons fire, you attack." It was insane. It was impossible. It was the kind of thing that only worked because no sane military doctrine would ever account for spaceships coordinating their movements to classical music. The Void Hunters found themselves under attack from directions that their tactical computers insisted were empty space, by weapons that their sensors couldn't track, coordinated by a communication system that their signal intelligence couldn't intercept because it was literally Tchaikovsky. For the first time in their recorded history, the Void Hunters were losing a battle. But they were far from defeated. As their systems came fully online, their true capabilities began to manifest. Weapons that could crack planets began targeting the primitive attackers. Defensive fields that could stop stellar radiation began adapting to block kinetic weapons. "We've got their attention," Marcus observed as massive energy beams began lashing through space around him. "Now we need to keep it." "Captain," called Chief Engineer Rodriguez from the Persistence-S engine room, "we're reading massive energy buildup from the lead Void Hunter ship. I think they're preparing some kind of super weapon." Marcus had been expecting this. The Void Hunter's pattern across 17 systems had always included a demonstration of overwhelming force designed to break enemy morale. Usually, they obliterated a major population center or military installation to prove their invincibility. "All ships, this is Chen. Execute Crazy Ivan." Across the battle space, human freighters suddenly began behaving like deranged things. Ships that had been following tactical doctrine suddenly broke formation and began flying directly at Void Hunter vessels, broadcasting challenges, insults, and what appeared to be advertising jingles from ancient Earth television. The Void Hunters' tactical computers, already strained by trying to process attacks coordinated to orchestral music, began to generate error messages as they tried to understand why enemy vessels were simultaneously attacking and attempting to sell them breakfast cereal. Approaching lead vessel, Marcus announced as the Persistence arrowed toward the massive Void Hunter flagship. His ship was accelerating far beyond her design specifications, her engines pushed past every safety margin by the simple expedient of disconnecting the safety systems entirely. "Marcus," Zaratieh's voice carried desperate concern, "what are you doing?" "Something stupid," Marcus replied. Around him, the Persistence-S hull groaned under acceleration stress while alarms that had been silenced days ago would have been screaming warnings about imminent catastrophic failure. The Void Hunter flagship was the size of a small city, its dark hull bristling with weapons that could sterilize worlds. As Marcus approached, he could see defensive turrets tracking his tiny freighter, undoubtedly puzzled about why a single obsolete vessel was approaching with apparent intent to ram. "Captain," Rodriguez called from the engine room, "the EMP capacitors are still charged. if we detonate them this close to a Void Hunter ship? I know, Marcus said quietly. It'll probably kill us all. But it might also overload their primary systems, Rodriguez continued. Take out their main computer core, maybe even trigger a cascade failure in their power grid. Marcus looked at the tactical display one last time. Around the system, the impossible battle was reaching its crescendo. Ships held together with determination and poor maintenance decisions were somehow holding their own against technology that belonged to Nightmare. But it wouldn't last. The Void Hunters were adapting, learning, beginning to counter their primitive tactics. They needed one more impossibility to tip the balance. All ships, this is Chen, Marcus announced over the acoustic system. It's been an honor serving with you magnificent bastards. He triggered the manual release on every safety system aboard the Persistence, then pushed the acceleration past the point where his ship should have torn itself apart. The Void Hunter flagship's defensive weapons opened fire, but they were calibrated for threats that made sense. Energy beams meant to stop massive warships passed harmlessly around a freighter too small and too primitive to register as a legitimate target. Marcus was still grinning when the Persistence impacted the Void Hunter ship's hull and detonated every piece of jerry-rigged electronics aboard in one glorious electromagnetic supernova. The explosion was visible from 3 star systems away. When the light faded, the Void Hunter flagship hung dead in space, its city-sized hull dark and lifeless. The electromagnetic cascade from the explosion had fried every circuit in its massive computer core, leaving it a drifting monument to the dangers of underestimating primitive technology. More importantly, the sight of their flagship, their invincible, unstoppable flagship, reduced to scrap metal, broke something fundamental in the Void Hunter fleet's psychology. For beings who had conquered through demonstrations of absolute power, the image of their most powerful vessel defeated by what appeared to be a garbage scow was incomprehensible. The remaining Void Hunter ships began to retreat. They're running, Zaratich's voice carried wonder and disbelief. The Void Hunters are actually running. Across the system, the impossible fleet, held together with human stubbornness, alien ingenuity, and coordination provided by classical music, watched as their unstoppable enemies fled into hyperspace. The silence that followed was broken only by the faint strains of Tchaikovsky's cannons, still broadcasting from the few remaining ships with functional speakers. In the aftermath, as rescue ships searched for survivors and engineers began trying to understand how any of the human vessels had continued functioning, Zaratich found herself standing in the ruins of the Kitharin Command Center, staring at the sensor logs that would reshape galactic military doctrine. "We actually won," she said to Admiral Kethvar, her carapace cycling through colors that had no translation in any language. "We did more than win," the Admiral replied. "We proved that the Void Hunters can be beaten. And we did it using tactics so primitive that half the galaxy will think our sensor logs are fabricated." Zaratich looked at the debris field where the Persistence had made her final flight. Somewhere in that expanding cloud of metal and glory was Marcus Chen, the human who had turned military impossibility into victory through sheer bloody-minded refusal to accept defeat. "They'll want to study this battle for centuries," she observed. "They'll want to," Admiral Kethvar agreed. "But I doubt any of them will understand it. You have to be slightly insane to appreciate the tactical brilliance of coordinating fleet movements to orchestral music." Zaratich made a sound that wasn't quite laughter, something between admiration and amazement. "He did exactly what he said he would do. He changed the rules." "No," the Admiral corrected. "He threw out the rules entirely and improvised something better." Across the galaxy, word of the Battle of Kythera spread like wildfire. The Void Hunters, the unstoppable force that had consumed 17 star systems, had been defeated by a ragtag fleet of primitive humans and alien allies using tactics so insane that they defied military analysis. More importantly, they'd been defeated by beings who refused to accept that superior technology meant inevitable victory. Within months, human military advisors were in desperate demand throughout civilized space, teaching courses with titles like Tactical Improvisation and Combat Applications of Calculated Insanity. Human freighter captains found themselves commanding star system defense fleets, not because they were the best tacticians, but because they were the only ones crazy enough to try winning impossible battles. The legend that began with alien laughter had become something larger than victory. It had become proof that the universe belonged not to the strongest or the most advanced, but to those stubborn enough to keep fighting when fighting made no sense. And, in the Outer Rim, where pirates and scavengers gathered to swap stories and trade gossip, they would tell each other about the human captain who had turned a rust bucket freighter into the weapon that broke the Void Hunter's invincibility. They would tell that story for 1,000 years. And, every time they told it, they would remember that sometimes the best response to superior force isn't better technology or superior tactics. Sometimes the best response is to be too stupid to know when you're beaten.